Few people expect that growth can quietly change how connected you feel to others. At the beginning of self-awareness, the experience feels expansive. You understand yourself more clearly. You regulate your emotions more effectively. You navigate situations with greater calm. There is a sense of internal stability that wasn't there before. And because of that, you might assume that your relationships will naturally improve as well. That deeper awareness will create deeper connection. That clarity will bring people closer. But something unexpected begins to happen instead. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. You begin to feel different, not better, not superior, just different. And at first, it's difficult to explain, because nothing obvious has changed on the surface. You are still interacting with the same people, having the same kinds of conversations, participating in the same environments. But internally, your experience of those interactions begins to shift. You may notice this in simple, everyday situations. You're in a group conversation. People are talking, laughing, sharing opinions, and outwardly, everything feels normal. But internally, something feels slightly misaligned. You begin noticing patterns in the conversation. You see how certain topics repeat, how certain reactions follow predictable emotional loops, how certain dynamics unfold almost automatically. Earlier in your life, you were part of that flow. You moved with it, reacted within it, engaged without much reflection. But now, you are not only participating, you are observing. And that observation creates a subtle distance, not because you are trying to separate yourself, but because you see more. And seeing more changes how you experience the same moment. Consider a familiar real-life example. You're with friends or colleagues, and a conversation turns toward criticism of someone who isn't present. Earlier, you might have joined in, agreed, added your perspective, participated in the shared emotional tone of the group. But now, something feels different. You notice the underlying projection. You recognize how the criticism reflects something unresolved in the people speaking. You see the emotional discharge happening in real time. And suddenly, the conversation feels less engaging, not because you think you are above it, but because you see through it. And seeing through it creates distance. You may still participate. You may still respond. But internally, the experience is not the same. Another example appears in more personal interactions. You are speaking with someone close to you. They are expressing frustration about a recurring situation in their life. As they speak, you begin recognizing patterns. You see how their behavior contributes to the outcome. You notice the unconscious dynamics they are repeating. Earlier, you might have responded emotionally, taken sides, reacted instinctively. But now, your awareness introduces a different layer. You listen differently. You process differently. And sometimes, you find yourself unsure how to respond, because what you see is more complex than what is being said. And this creates a subtle tension. You want to connect, but your perception has changed. Carl Jung believed that individuation naturally leads to differentiation. The individual becomes more distinct from collective patterns, more aware of unconscious dynamics, less identified with automatic group behavior. And while this differentiation is essential for psychological maturity, it also changes how connection is experienced. Because much of human bonding is unconscious. It happens through shared reactions, shared assumptions, shared emotional patterns. When two people respond in similar ways without questioning those responses, a sense of connection is created. But as awareness increases, those unconscious alignments begin to dissolve. You no longer react in exactly the same way. You no longer participate in certain dynamics as easily. And because of that, the sense of effortless connection can begin to shift. You may notice that some conversations feel more difficult to engage in, not because you lack interest, but because your perception has deepened. Topics that once felt stimulating may now feel repetitive. Emotional exchanges that once felt natural may now feel predictable. You begin to sense the underlying structure of interactions. And once you see the structure, it becomes harder to fully immerse yourself in it. This is where many people begin to experience a quiet form of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of being psychologically out of sync. You are still surrounded by people, still connected externally. But internally, something has changed. And that change creates a feeling that is difficult to articulate because it is not caused by rejection. It is not caused by conflict. It is caused by awareness. You may even question this feeling. You may wonder, why do I feel disconnected when nothing is wrong? Why do conversations feel different now? Why do certain interactions feel less fulfilling? These questions are common at this stage, and they often lead to confusion because growth is usually associated with improvement, with expansion, with increased connection. But Jung understood that growth also involves separation, not as an end state, but as a phase, a necessary differentiation from unconscious patterns. He wrote about the individual's need to separate from what he called the collective, the shared psychological field where many behaviors, beliefs, and reactions operate unconsciously. As long as you're fully immersed in that field, connection feels effortless because you are moving with the same patterns. But as individuation progresses, you begin stepping out of that unconscious alignment. You begin seeing the patterns instead of being fully inside them. And this creates a shift because connection now requires something different. It requires conscious engagement, not automatic participation. And conscious engagement is more demanding. It requires presence. It requires intention. It requires choosing how to respond rather than reacting automatically. And not everyone operates at that level consistently, which means that your experience of connection begins to change. You may notice that certain relationships feel less natural, not because the people have changed, but because your way of relating has changed. You are no longer connecting purely through shared unconscious patterns. You are relating through awareness, and that alters the dynamic. In some cases, this creates distance. In others, it creates depth. But in either case, the experience is different. You may also notice that your tolerance for certain environments begins to shift. Situations that once felt normal may now feel overwhelming or draining, not because they are objectively negative, but because you are more sensitive to the psychological dynamics within them. You pick up on emotional undercurrents more quickly. You notice inconsistencies more clearly. You feel the energy of interactions more intensely, and this increased sensitivity can make certain environments feel misaligned. You may find yourself withdrawing more often, seeking quieter spaces, preferring fewer but more meaningful interactions. And while this can support your growth, it can also contribute to the feeling of separation because your social world begins to narrow, not intentionally, but naturally. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation often involves a period of isolation, not necessarily physical isolation, but psychological separation, a phase where the individual is no longer fully identified with collective patterns, but has not yet fully established new forms of connection. This in-between state can feel uncertain. You are no longer who you were, but you are still becoming who you are. And during this transition, loneliness can appear, not as a permanent condition, but as a signal that your relationship with connection is evolving. You are learning to relate from a different place, a more conscious place. But that place is still stabilizing, still integrating. And until it does, there may be moments where you feel slightly out of sync with the world around you. This is a subtle separation that growth can create, not dramatic, not isolating in an obvious way, but quiet, internal, difficult to explain to others. Because from the outside, everything may look the same, but from inside, everything feels different. And recognizing this experience is important, because without understanding it, you may misinterpret it. You may think something is wrong, that you are losing connection, that growth is creating distance in a negative sense. But in reality, something more nuanced is happening. You are not necessarily becoming disconnected. You are becoming differentiated. And differentiation is the first step toward a deeper, more conscious form of connection. But before that new connection stabilizes, there is often a period where you feel the space in between, and that space can feel like loneliness. A deeper understanding begins when you realize that most human connection is not built on awareness, but on shared unconscious patterns. At first, this idea may seem surprising, because connection often feels intentional. You talk to someone, you relate to their experiences, you feel understood, you feel aligned, and it appears as if this connection is based on conscious interaction. But if you observe more closely, something else becomes visible. Many of the strongest bonds form not through conscious understanding, but through unconscious synchronization. You may notice this in everyday interactions. Two people complain about similar frustrations. They validate each other's reactions. They reinforce each other's perspective. And in that shared emotional space, a sense of closeness emerges. Or consider how quickly people bond over shared dislikes, a mutual irritation, a common enemy, a shared judgment. These moments create immediate connection, not because they are deeply examined, but because they are emotionally aligned. Carl Jung referred to this as participation in the collective unconscious, a shared psychological field where individuals connect through common patterns, reactions, and assumptions without necessarily being aware of them. And as long as you are fully participating in this field, connection feels effortless. You don't have to think about how to relate. You simply do. But as awareness increases, something begins to change. You start noticing the patterns that underlie these interactions. You see how conversations are shaped by projection. You recognize how emotional reactions spread between people. You observe how certain dynamics repeat across different contexts. And once you see these patterns, your relationship to them shifts. You are no longer fully inside them. You are observing them. And this observation creates a subtle but significant separation. Consider a real-life situation. You're in a workplace environment where colleagues often bond through shared frustration about management. Earlier, you might have participated fully, expressed your own frustrations, agreed with others, felt a sense of unity through that shared perspective. But now, something is different. You still understand the frustration. You may even agree with parts of it. But you also notice how the conversation reinforces negativity, how it cycles without resolution, how it becomes a repetitive, emotional loop. And because you see this, your engagement changes. You may speak less, or speak differently, or feel less drawn to the conversation altogether. And this is where a shift begins. Because while others are still connecting through that shared unconscious pattern, you are no longer fully participating in it. And as a result, the sense of connection changes, not necessarily disappearing, but becoming less immediate. Another example appears in personal relationships. You are with someone who reacts emotionally to a situation. Their reaction is intense. They express frustration, disappointment, or anger. Earlier, you might have mirrored that emotion, matched their intensity, validated their reaction without much reflection, and this created a sense of closeness, a shared emotional experience. But now, your awareness introduces a different response. You notice the emotional pattern. You recognize the projection. You see the underlying cause of the reaction. And instead of fully mirroring it, you respond with more distance, more reflection, more calm. And while this may be healthier, it also changes the dynamic, because the other person may still be operating within the unconscious emotional loop, and your response no longer matches that loop. This can create a subtle feeling of disconnection, not because you care less, but because you are relating from a different level of awareness. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation involves withdrawing projections, seeing reality more clearly, becoming less entangled in unconscious dynamics. But he also understood that this process alters how individuals relate to each other, because much of what feels like connection is actually shared unconsciousness. And when that shared unconsciousness begins to dissolve, something else is required for connection to continue: consciousness. But conscious connection is different. It is slower, more intentional, less reactive. It requires both individuals to be present, to listen, to engage without relying entirely on automatic patterns. And not all relationships are structured this way. You may begin to notice that some connections feel harder to maintain, not because there is conflict, but because the foundation of the connection has shifted. You're no longer bonding through the same unconscious mechanisms. And if the relationship does not evolve into a more conscious form of connection, distance can emerge. This is where many people begin to feel isolated, not because they have rejected others, but because the way they relate has changed. You may find that certain conversations feel exhausting, not because of the people involved, but because you are constantly aware of the underlying dynamics. You see the repetition, the projection, the emotional patterns, and maintaining engagement in those dynamics requires effort because you are aware of what is happening beneath the surface. This awareness can also affect how you experience group settings. You may notice that group energy feels more intense, more layered. You pick up on subtle shifts in mood, unspoken tensions, emotional undercurrents. And while others may move through these environments without much reflection, you experience them more deeply. This can make certain situations feel overwhelming or draining, not because they are inherently negative, but because your perception has expanded. And with expanded perception comes increased sensitivity. Carl Jung believed that as consciousness grows, the individual becomes more differentiated from collective, less influenced by unconscious group dynamics, more anchored in their own internal awareness. But this differentiation comes with a cost. It reduces the ease of unconscious belonging. You can no longer merge into the group in the same way. You remain aware, and that awareness creates a boundary, not a physical boundary, but a psychological one. You are present, but not fully absorbed. And this can feel like standing slightly apart, even when you are surrounded by others. You may also notice that your interests begin to change. Topics that once felt engaging may now feel surface level. You may find yourself drawn to deeper conversations, more reflective exchanges, discussions that explore meaning rather than just events. And when those conversations are not available, you may feel a sense of lack, not because something is missing externally, but because your internal orientation has shifted. This can lead to moments where you feel misunderstood, not in an overt way, but in a subtle, underlying sense. You may feel that what you are perceiving is not fully shared by others, that your level of awareness is not always mirrored, and this creates a gap, a space between your experience and theirs. Carl Jung described this as part of the individuation journey. The individual becomes more distinct, more aware, more internally grounded. But this process often involves a period where connection feels less immediate, because the old forms of connection are no longer fully satisfying, and the new forms are still developing. This is an important distinction, because without understanding it, you may interpret this experience as alienation, as if something has gone wrong, as if you are becoming disconnected from others in a negative way. But there's a difference between alienation and differentiation. Alienation is a loss of connection. Differentiation is a transformation of connection. You are not losing the ability to relate. You are changing how you relate. And this change requires adjustment for you and for the people around you. Some relationships will adapt. They will deepen. They will evolve into more conscious forms of connection. Others may remain at the level of unconscious bonding. And in those cases, the distance may persist, not as a failure, but as a natural outcome of growth. This is why awareness can feel isolating at times, because it removes certain forms of easy connection. But it also opens a possibility for something more authentic, more grounded, more real. However, that transition is not immediate. There is often a period where you feel the absence of the old before the new fully forms. And during that period, loneliness can emerge, not as a permanent state, but as a reflection of change, a signal that your relationship with connection is evolving, and that evolution, while necessary, requires time to stabilize. A turning point appears when you realize that the loneliness created by awareness is not something to escape, but something to understand and integrate. Up to this stage, the experience has felt like separation. You see more, you perceive more, you feel less able to participate in unconscious dynamics, and as a result, connection has changed, sometimes weakened, sometimes complicated, sometimes replaced by a quiet sense of distance. But what begins to emerge at this point is a deeper question. Not why do I feel alone, but how do I relate now that I see differently? Because the goal of individuation was never isolation. Carl Jung never suggested that becoming conscious meant withdrawing permanently from others. In fact, he emphasized that true individuation allows for deeper, more authentic relationships. But those relationships are no longer built the same way. They are no longer based on unconscious merging. They are based on conscious presence. And this requires a fundamental shift in how you approach connection. You may begin to notice that your earlier way of relating relied heavily on emotional synchronization. You felt close to people when you shared the same reactions, the same opinions, the same emotional tone. But now, your awareness interrupts that automatic synchronization. You no longer react identically. You no longer agree automatically. You no longer merge without reflection. And this creates a new challenge. How do you stay connected without pretending not to see? How do you relate without abandoning your awareness? This is where integration begins. Because the answer is not to return to unconsciousness, and it is not to remain detached. It is to develop a new way of engaging, one that includes awareness without using it as a barrier. Consider a real-life situation. You are in a conversation where someone is expressing a strong emotional reaction. You recognize the pattern behind it. You see the projection. You understand the underlying dynamic. At earlier stages, you might have done one of two things. Either you would have joined the emotional reaction, or you would have withdrawn internally, feeling disconnected. But now, a third option becomes available. You remain present. You listen. You acknowledge their experience without reinforcing the unconscious pattern. You respond with awareness, but without superiority. And this creates a different kind of interaction, one that is grounded but still connected. This is not easy, because it requires holding two positions at once. You are aware of the deeper dynamics, and you are still engaged in the human interaction. Carl Jung believed that true psychological maturity involves holding opposites, being both differentiated and connected, both aware and engaged, both individual and relational. And this balance is not automatic. It must be developed. You may notice this development in how you respond to conversations that once felt misaligned. Instead of disengaging completely, you begin choosing how to participate. You may not engage in every dynamic. You may not resonate with every topic, but you remain open, curious, present, and this presence changes the quality of connection, because connection is no longer based on sameness. It is based on authenticity. Another example appears in how you experience differences between yourself and others. Earlier, difference may have created friction or unconscious alignment. Now, difference becomes something you can observe without needing to resolve immediately. You may not think the same way, feel the same way, react the same way, and yet you can remain in connection because you are no longer relying on similarity as the only basis for relationship. This is a significant shift because it expands your capacity to relate. You are no longer limited to people who mirror your internal state. You can connect across differences, across levels of awareness, across perspectives. But this requires something important: humility, not intellectual humility, but relational humility. The understanding that awareness does not place you above others. It places you in a different position of responsibility. You see more, but that does not mean you are beyond what you see. Carl Jung repeatedly warned against the danger of identifying with awareness in a way that creates separation through superiority, because that form of separation is not individuation. It is inflation. True differentiation does not isolate you from others in a hierarchical way. It allows you to remain yourself while still relating. And this is where many people must make an internal adjustment, because the loneliness they feel is sometimes reinforced by subtle withdrawal, a tendency to disengage from interactions that feel unconscious, a tendency to retreat into observation rather than participation. And while this may feel protective, it can also deepen the sense of isolation. Integration requires re-engagement, but a different kind of re-engagement, one that does not abandon awareness, but also does not use awareness as a reason to disconnect. You may begin to notice that certain relationships evolve naturally. They deepen. They become more reflective, more open, more conscious. These relationships feel different, less reactive, more grounded, and they provide a sense of connection that aligns with your awareness. At the same time, other relationships may remain unchanged. They may continue operating within familiar patterns. And in those cases, your role becomes one of conscious participation. You engage where it feels authentic. You step back where it does not. But you do not need to fully withdraw. This flexibility is part of integration because it allows you to navigate different relational contexts without losing yourself. Carl Jung believed that the self integrates opposites, and one of the central opposites in this stage is individuality and connection, the ability to be distinct without being isolated, the ability to be aware without being detached, the ability to see clearly without losing warmth. This is where loneliness begins to transform. It no longer feels like absence. It becomes space. Space that allows for more intentional connection, more selective engagement, more meaningful interaction. You may find that you no longer seek constant connection, but you value deeper connection more. You become comfortable with moments of solitude, not as isolation, but as integration, a space where you process, reflect, stabilize your awareness. And from that space, you return to relationships differently, more grounded, more intentional, more aligned. This is a transition from unconscious belonging to conscious connection. And it is not immediate. It unfolds over time, through experience, through trial and error, through moments of disconnection and reconnection. But gradually, something stabilizes. You no longer feel as disoriented by the differences you perceive. You no longer interpret distance as something negative. You understand it as part of differentiation. And from that understanding, a new kind of connection becomes possible. One that does not require you to reduce your awareness. One that does not depend on unconscious alignment. One that is built on presence, authenticity, and mutual recognition. This is where individuation begins to integrate back into relationship, not as a return to how things were, but as a movement forward, into a way of relating that includes both depth and connection, both awareness and humanity. And in that space, loneliness is no longer something you are trying to escape. It becomes something you have moved through, on your way to a more conscious form of belonging. There's a moment in this journey where you begin to understand that what you once called loneliness was not simply the absence of people. It was the absence of unconscious connection. And that distinction changes everything. Because at the beginning of this experience, it feels like something has been lost. Conversations feel thinner. Interactions feel less engaging. Certain relationships no longer carry the same sense of ease. And naturally, the mind tries to interpret this. It wonders if something is wrong, if growth has created distance, if awareness has taken something away. But as you move deeper into this process, another realization begins to emerge. Nothing essential was taken from you. Something unconscious was simply revealed. Carl Jung understood that individuation does not remove your ability to connect. It transforms the foundation of connection. It moves you from unconscious participation to conscious relationship. And that transition includes a phase where the old way of relating no longer fits. But the new way has not yet fully stabilized. This is a space where loneliness lives, not as a permanent condition, but as a threshold, a psychological space between who you were and how you now relate. And thresholds are not comfortable places. They are uncertain, undefined. You cannot go back fully, but you are not yet fully settled forward. And this is why this stage feels so subtle and difficult to explain. Because externally, your life may look the same, but internally, your experience has changed. You see more, you feel more, you understand more. And because of that, your relationship with connection becomes more selective, more intentional, more real, but also at times more quiet. Carl Jung emphasized that the individual must learn to stand apart from the collective without losing the capacity to relate to it. And this is where the true challenge lies, not in becoming separate, but in remaining connected without dissolving your awareness. Because it is easy to misunderstand this stage. Some people attempt to solve the loneliness by returning to unconscious patterns, by forcing themselves back into familiar dynamics, by ignoring what they see in order to feel connected again. But this creates internal conflict, because once you see clearly, you cannot fully unsee. Others move in the opposite direction. They withdraw, they detach, they begin to observe life more than participate in it. And while this may feel aligned with awareness, it can quietly deepen the sense of isolation, Because awareness was never meant to remove you from life. It was meant to bring you into it more consciously. This is a balance that must be learned. To remain aware and still remain human. To see clearly and still engage. To recognize patterns and still allow connection. This is not automatic. It is a skill, a psychological capacity that develops over time. You begin to understand that not every interaction needs to be perfect. Not every conversation needs to be deeply meaningful. Not every person needs to meet you at the same level of awareness. And this understanding creates flexibility. You no longer expect connection to look one specific way. You allow different forms of connection to exist. Some light, some deep, some temporary, some lasting. And within that range, you begin to find your place again, not by lowering your awareness, but by expanding your capacity to relate. Carl Jung's work consistently pointed toward integration, not separation as an endpoint, but as a phase that leads to a more complete form of connection. A connection that does not require you to abandon yourself. A connection that does not depend on unconscious alignment. A connection that can hold both difference and presence at the same time. And this is where something important stabilizes. You begin to feel less disturbed by the moments of distance. You no longer interpret them as failure. You recognize them as part of differentiation. And from that recognition, loneliness begins to change its meaning. It is no longer something you are trying to escape. It becomes something you can sit with, understand, move through, because you see that it is not emptiness. It is space. Space that allows for more authentic connection to emerge. You may notice that the relationships that remain begin to feel different, less reactive, less based on shared patterns, more grounded in presence, in mutual respect, in genuine engagement. And these relationships, while perhaps fewer, feel more aligned, more real, more sustainable. At the same time, your relationship with yourself deepens. You become more comfortable in your own presence, less dependent on constant interaction, less driven by the need to fill silence. And this does not mean you no longer value connection. It means you are no longer using it to escape yourself. This is where psychological maturity begins to feel stable, not because loneliness disappears completely, but because it no longer defines your experience. You understand it, you contextualize it, you integrate it, and from that place, you move differently, you connect differently, you relate differently. Before we close, consider this honestly. Have you ever felt surrounded by people and still sense a quiet distance within yourself? Not because you didn't care, but because you saw something others didn't name? When was the first time you noticed that shift? Take a moment to reflect on that, because that moment may not have been a sign of disconnection. It may have been the beginning of differentiation. And differentiation is not the end of connection. It is the beginning of a more conscious form of it. If this resonated with you, share your experience in the comments, not to explain it perfectly, but to express it honestly. Someone reading your words may recognize the same quiet shift in their own life, and that recognition may help them understand that what they are feeling is not isolation, but transformation, because in the end, awareness does not separate you from others permanently. It teaches you how to stand within yourself and still reach toward others, not unconsciously, but consciously. And that kind of connection, while it takes time to build, is far deeper than anything you had before.